Have you ever heard of the saying, measure twice, cut once? Well, that's great when you're talking about a boat, but really if you're building something new on board, you absolutely want a template. Hi, I'm Nika Waters and welcome to the Boat Galley podcast. Today we're talking about templating, how to do it, and why you want to do it. Because it's not quite so simple on a boat with all the curves and weird angles to get the straight parts that you want when you're making something new. This episode of the Boat Galley podcast is sponsored by SeaTech Systems. SeaTech offers cruiser-tested solutions for weather, navigation, and communications. SeaTech solutions include satellite internet, Wi-Fi, cellular, and SSB. What's more, SeaTech offers DIY electronics consulting with custom wiring diagrams and professional advice for your own electronics DIY installation and integration projects. Visit sea-tech.com, that's SEA-TECH.com for more information. As a bonus, Boat Galley podcast listeners get free shipping from SeaTech with the code GALLEY2019 at checkout. The very first time we wanted to build new countertops for our boat, we wrestled pieces of cardboard down and lay them out, cursing every time there was a fold from an old box. This time around, we're using small pieces of batten and the secret ingredient, which is hot glue. So a little bit of background. Those of you who follow my blog or have listened to the podcast might realize that we're in the middle of a pretty big refit on board our 28-foot sailboat that we've owned since 1992. Just as when you've lived someplace for a long time, you want to shift some things up, well, we feel the same way with the boat. So we're in the middle of major projects. One of the challenges with being on a boat is that all the spaces and all the angles are not square. They're not really symmetrical, and they're pretty hard just to draw a rectangle and make that work. Templating is the idea of mocking up and kind of making a practice piece that you're going to use for your final product. Now, you can template or mock up something as basic as a new small bulkhead. You can mock up new countertops. You can mock up a whole new table or a new settee berth. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to talk about templating a space that already has at least one surface that's kind of there. So if you are, for instance, templating your counter to put in on the galley, you already have the vertical pieces in place. So you're just looking to figure out the correct dimensions and shape of the flat piece that's going on top. And yes, you absolutely could get out cardboard. You could try to do a paper template and do a piece of kind of craft paper and go along. You could get a thin piece of plywood and do a lot of cutting and measuring and cutting and measuring. Our version of templating involves very thin pieces of wood. You can buy battens at the hardware store, or you can just rip a 2x4 into really thin strips using a power saw. It also involves measuring, and it involves hot glue. Did you ever think you were going to need hot glue on a boat? I didn't, but boy, is it ever useful. And that hot glue gun that we used for kids' crafts projects, that's definitely coming with us this time we go cruising. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to measure a small batten piece. You're going to bring it down. So let's say for the sake of argument, let's say you're building a new settee bunk cover. A new settee flat horizontal piece. You're going to take that batten, and if you know that your settee, the settee is, call it 3 feet wide, you can actually measure, and that's a little bit of an overstatement, but if that's what you know you have, you can cut that batten to a very rough piece length and just bring the batten, one thin batten, bring it down, and you mark it exactly, you lay it out exactly along one edge of what you are trying to template. And then what you do is you build on that batten. So if you are trying to make a rectangle, which on a boat generally doesn't only involve being a rectangle, but you've got the kind of relative straight ends fore and aft, but then the outboard edge, and particularly if it's going along the hull, there's going to be some curvature to it. And what you can do is you cut that batten, those thin pieces of batten, into smaller pieces and get the curve exactly right. And you use the hot glue to attach each one to the one before. And what will happen when you're done is you're going to have it's going to look really funny. It's going to look like you have created some mock weird raft almost out of really thin pieces of batten, and they're all hot glued together, but the shape is just about exactly the right way that you want it, including the curvature of the hull. And then you can take this whole template, this piece of batten glued together template, and take it back to the house or to the workbench or to the dock or wherever it is that you're building the larger piece. And you can put that template directly onto your piece of plywood and mark the plywood without having to cut the plywood into smaller pieces, without having to do anything else to it. And you've actually got a really great mock shape that gets the curve of the hull just the way you want it to. And then you can bring the plywood down and finish the fine-tuned cutting, but you will have gotten a very, very, very close, rough shaping by using the battens. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to measure the batten piece to fit where you want it to go. Then you're going to create smaller batten pieces and glue them together as you follow the shape of the hull along. These little pieces of tape, when you're doing these little pieces of wood and the batten strips, it's not unlike trying to follow the curve of something with straight pieces of tape. And you know that if you do shorter pieces, you can create the curve and put them together on top of each other. And that's pretty much what you're doing with these really thin pieces of wood. Instead of trying to do it with a super long batten and curving, you're actually cutting little pieces and you're just making the incremental changes in the angle as you're going. The hot glue, it's not permanent. No, it's not waterproof, but you don't need it to be. You just need it to be strong enough and quick enough to be able to make the shape that you want it to. Then, when you're all done, you can actually cut those batten pieces and reuse them for the next templating round. So you're not having to carry lots of excess material that you're not going to reuse. It's pretty cool. So to remind, the first thing you're going to do is measure the battens, and then you're going to cut, and then you fit the pieces together, one piece on top of the other, using hot glue. And then you're going to mark the template so you make sure that you know which side is up and which way you want to cut the plywood. This is particularly important if you are worried about which way the plywood, if you're worried about how the plywood is going to appear, if the plywood is going to be a finish facing plywood and you need to make sure that it's pretty, then you have to template and mark the side of the template because you don't want to put the wrong side of the template down because the shape will be wrong when you do it. And then lay that template down on top of the plywood and cut away. We're so excited that we figured out this way of templating. It's so far proven absolutely incredibly useful. We feel super smart when we do it, and it's really, really easy. Hope that this helps. There are pictures on my blog, which is linked in the show notes, or if you prefer to read, there are some more details in there as well. But I strongly suggest using thin pieces of batten, a measuring tape, and some hot glue. And you'll have your next interior project laid out and organized in just the best way possible. I can't wait to see you out there. Thanks so much for listening to the Boat Galley podcast. We love answering questions that you have, and we love hearing from our listeners. Please drop us a line, and don't forget to tell your friends all about the Boat Galley podcast. We look forward to seeing you out there. Bye for now.